go up there, but you can't go off-road it.
Is the sand really soft up there?
No, it's just like bumpy as hell, and you can't. Like we had to pay an extra $1,000 to get cars clean because they were that like wrecked.
Because I know when I did an off-road course there, the sand was so fine on the track. Because when you started, I just sort of like.
Was it defensive driving?
No, I just did an off-road course before I was it was great fun, but I took the clutch the first thing I did because you know that nice smell of burning clutch. Because I just try to start like set off like you normally would, like just sort of braking the clutch and sort of like light point and then just setting on slowly. That doesn't work apparently. You have to get the clutch out damn quickly, otherwise you just end up spinning the wheels instead of the clutch, which is what I did.
I come from the desert back home, so like driving
Yeah.
all these exchange students are like, oh yeah, the person from the desert can drive like
You desert man, show us your ways.
But also like going 90k on a dirt road, on a dirt road, and the cow comes out in front of you. That was a hell of an experience. So I can just spun out and almost rolled it.
Assignments write an AI to play this game.
Fair enough.
It was a wicked trip. One bad night, I got stuck in full of
So much there. Have you seen this show?
Whereabouts you from?
Every night to Saturday.
I just imagine you changing the lanes by just changing the wheels slightly and like slowly moving across the lane over the space of about 500 meters.
So going like around turns and stuff in the road wasn't bad. Nice one Friday. You don't have that much traction.
Yeah. Good by Friday.
You can't go over like 50 miles an hour. It's just because the fucking transmission is so slow. So if you're doing like 60, which would be like 35 miles an hour.
I was away for a week. And then we had to go back after that.
Anytime we have to make like a sharp turn, just be in the outside lane. Go into the outside lane.
But not a lot.
Once we got back in the city, it was better.
I just imagining poor like actors straining along.
I did, Tom.
You did?
Yep.
You're not wearing the drunk glasses today.
I just had them on. You missed them.
Go. That's cool, because you didn't cover anything important, did you?
No. It's metaphysics.
At no point did we cover anything important.
Let's avoid this at all costs.
You did miss a very important video.
I'll post it on your wall.
Or
I'll post it on your wall.
I showed that to Ruby, and now he's got that song stuck in his head. And he's like wandering around the office singing it to himself.
Don't do that. Poor Ruby's distracted enough as it is.
You keep asking questions.
All right. Is this thing on? Okay, so before we get started, I have some potentially exciting information for you. So, you may remember that there was a competition to draw a time machine plan. Here are the entries. I'm just going to go through these slowly. I'll put these up for you. So these are from both Sydney and here, right? So just quickly, these are the entries. First one. That's the second one. Assemble box, hang sign on box. That's the. Actually, these aren't in order. Whatevs. So that's Claire's. Yep. That one's quite scarily plausible, actually. This one's an IKEA box. Just keep in mind that if you cannot find the Allen key, the T-Rex has it. This one is just a picture of a flux capacitor and the working time machine from Back to the Future 1, which was on TV last night. I hope you all did your homework. This is another cardboard box. I don't know what's with Sydney, like just drawing pictures of cardboard boxes and thinking that's okay. Come on, man up, Sydney. This is a armchair that travels at 1 second per second into the future. That was your second idea, was it? Here's the Love Boat time machine. Powered by love. I think this is important. May only create the illusion of time travel. So, yeah. This is a... Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. It's quite pretty. Points for... this looks like a Stargate. Yeah, anyway, you can look at these yourself, and then we're back to the start. Yours is there. I don't know. I think it's just on random. Hang on. Yeah. What the hell? Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Sorry, there's your one. There's your one with my personal favourite, the Minonian inertial light speed oscillators, the Milo-tins. And this is rubies, yes? Rotate. There we go, which is the literal egg timer. I liked the fact that you had a lunchbox in there. Thought that was very practical. If you're travelling through time, you don't know when you're going to get lunch, so seems like a good thing. Yeah, but you might not have lunch with you at lunchtime. Shut up. Okay, can I have a drum roll, please? All right, that's enough. Shut up. Claire, you won. And which means that you have the honoured distinction of having thrashed Sydney, which allows me, when I go back to Sydney, to lord it over my friend. So I'm personally grateful for that. So in case you're wondering, here, Dave Chalmers sent me an email.
You sent comments.
He did. He actually scored every single entry.
Out of what?
I don't know, out of Dave. Out of 10 for aesthetics, amusement, and plausibility. And there you are, Claire. The clear winner, 25. So he said, great bunch of entries based on gut reactions rather than scoring. The winner was clearly 5 by a mile, with honourable mention to for 9, 14, and 15. Detailed scores seem to fit that reasonably well. There you go. In case you ever wanted Dave Chalmers to score a drawing that you did. Now, supposedly, contrary to what I said, there is a prize, but I don't know what it is. To what? To Chalmers Drawing School for Time Machine Blueprints. To the future. Your prize is this calculator that I just found next to the desk. There might actually be a real prize. I don't know. Do you want a marker as well? All right, there we go. I'll put them up on my website. You can look at all of them. Yeah. Claire's was the one that was scarily plausible. So Claire's involved, I think this one particularly pleased Chalmers, given that he's written a bit on this sort of stuff. So Claire's involved encoding all of the information in a person into digital information, and then building an arc that contains the information, waiting for the universe to end, and then as the universe kicks over again, the arc unpacks at the time at which you want to go to. As I said, disturbingly plausible. Sorry? By hiding in a black hole. There you go. As I said.
So really, we shouldn't be worried about the black hole.
Well, you'd want to be in like a digital form so you can be scared by it.
Come on, PowerPoint. Microsoft PowerPoint. All right, let's roll. Okay, so last week I was talking about some different ways to travel through time. We tried to kill our own grandfathers, and we couldn't, which made grandfather happy, yay! Today I'm going to talk to you about some informational paradoxes involving closed time-like curves Then I'm going to talk to you about the promised Institute for Auto-Infanticide. And if we get time, I'm going to talk to you about hypertemporal paradoxes. So we're actually going to try and kill our grandfathers again, and I'll show you a way in which you can kill your grandfather. It involves traveling into a different temporal dimension, though. So there's that. All right. So remember, Tim the Time Traveler travels backwards in time with murderous intentions. He's going to try and kill his grandfather. This is going automatically. Hang on. Sorry. All right. So Tim the Time Traveler travels backwards in time with murderous intentions to kill his grandfather before his father was born. If Tim succeeds, he'll never be born and will never travel back in time. So he'll bring it about that he both does and does not travel back in time, which results in a contradiction and involves a paradox. This is just a very sort of salient way of drawing out the paradox, but actually the paradox can be created by doing anything in the past that didn't actually happen, right? So if you've got a set of facts about the past and they are one particular way, and you travel back in time and try and change those facts to the way that they really were, then you're going to induce some kind of contradiction. It both will be the case that something occurred in the past, and it won't be the case that something occurred in the past. Grandfather paradoxes sort of draw it out really explicitly, but actually any attempt to change the past from how it was will induce a contradiction and will give rise to exactly the same problem. Right. The good news is that you shouldn't really worry if you happen to travel back through time about changing the past, because you can't, right? All you can do is become complicit in the causal system of events that actually happened, right? So you often see this in time travel stories where someone travels back in time to try and change the past, but they end up bringing about the very thing that they're trying to prevent, right? Or otherwise being involved in the causal chain of events. There you go. So as we were discussing last week, something always happens to stop you from traveling, stop you from killing your grandfather, right? And Lewis put this in terms of some coincidence that happens. So you'll have a sudden change of heart, you'll have your gun jam, you'll slip on a banana peel, you'll shoot the wrong person. All these different sorts of things will step in to stop you from killing your grandfather. Why? Because it's going to be inconsistent to succeed, right? So something has to stop you. It doesn't matter what, just something has to stop you. Okay. I think I'm going to actually come back to this if we have time. I'm going to go straight for your Institute for Auto-Infanticide. All right, so Paul Horwich develops this thought experiment in response to Lewis's paper. He says, suppose that in the future, the Institute for Auto-Infanticide is developed. And what the Institute does is it trains soldiers and sends them back in time to try and kill themselves. It trains thousands and thousands and thousands of time-traveling soldiers. Now, these soldiers, according to Lewis, will all fail to succeed in killing their infant selves, right? Because if they succeed, then they'll induce a contradiction, they'll induce a paradox. Paradoxes are impossible, so they're all going to fail. But if you follow Lewis's story, each failure will be a coincidence of some kind, right? So each soldier will slip on a banana peel at the last minute, their gun will jam, they'll have a sudden change of heart, they'll shoot the wrong person. And what Horwich says is that these coincidences, each one on its own, is extremely unlikely, right? And what you're going to end up with if time travel is possible is a long string of extremely improbable events, right? All these different gun jammings and slips on banana peels. And so what Horwich said is, look, time travel isn't impossible, right? It's possible, it's just extremely improbable. Because if time travel were happening, you would have these long runs of coincidental events, and if you have these long runs of coincidental events, something really weird looks like it's happening. Okay? So you send thousands of these soldiers back in time, and it's not going to create any paradox per se, but you do have this sort of oddity where you've got thousands of coincidences that seem like really strange coincidences, right? Not just everyday coincidences, but sort of long runs of someone repeatedly failing to do something. And the same thing. So we don't see these strings of coincidences around us, presumably. I mean, we haven't heard about someone who's just sort of hell-bent on trying to kill another person, and they're just constantly thwarted by some weird coincidence. That seems like the sort of thing that would get reported in the news. We just don't hear about those sorts of things, let alone it happening thousands of times. Right? And so time travel implies the possibility of long strings of low probability events, and so Horwitz says it's an improbable event, right? Time travel is extremely unlikely to happen. All right, so now we're going, that's the basic response to Lewis's paper that Horwitz outlines. What we're going to look at now is whether that's a real problem or not, right? Whether we should be worried about the Institute for Auto-Infanticide. The first thing we need to look at is this point about not seeing these strings of coincidences around us, right? So what does this actually tell us? Well, what it tells us at best is that there's no time travel from the local future back to here, right? There's no sort of people that are trying to travel back to our time and carry out murderous acts, but like trying to kill their grandfather, right? So it doesn't necessarily tell you that, so you can sort of understand why it is that we don't see these strings of coincidences. It doesn't sort of tell you that time travel is improbable or impossible or anything like that. At best, it just sort of shows you that, you know, time travel's not happening around here, okay? But you might still be worried because we've got this conceptual possibility that time travel would bring about all of these low probability events. And to be honest, I think it probably, like you might sit there thinking, but no one's going to actually build the Institute for Auto-Infanticide. I think that's the first thing we'd build, right? I mean, why not? I mean, everyone's sort of worried about these time travel paradoxes. I think the first thing we try and do is actually test out whether you can kill your grandfather in the past. So probably this isn't as crazy as it sounds. Yeah, Adam. In what sense are they not low probability? Yeah. Which slide? Yeah. Yeah.
Is very low, but the probability of me killing, the probability of me failing to kill my grandfather is very low.
Yeah.
But the probability of me failing to kill my grandfather in this condition, given that he was 25, is in fact 1.
Okay, so it's not the probability of killing your grandfather, right? That's not the relevant probability, right? We know that you can't. It is probability 0 that you'll be able to kill your grandfather, right? The probability is attached to the accidents that step in to stop you, right? So, and you can make these quite unlikely. So suppose that you're a trained marksman, right? You've spent like years and years and years and years training to kill people, and you've killed like 1,000 people, right? 1,000 grandfathers just to get like good at it, right? And so there's a very low probability that you yourself would miss, let alone 1,000 people trained in that way, right? No. So the probability that they will miss is 1, right? That's absolutely right? But the event that happens, the accident that happens, looks like the kind of thing that we would typically associate a low probability with, right? Someone who's extremely well trained at shooting people suddenly being subject to 1,000 gun jammings in a row would seem extremely coincidental, right? Would seem very mysterious to us, right? So it's not the probability of succeeding. We know that that's probability 0. It's not the probability that, like the probability of failure. We know that that's probability 1, right? It's the probability of the accident that happens to prevent you, right? And those events, according to Horwitz, look extremely unlikely, right? We don't typically see people who are trying to, you know, murder someone else be subject to a long string of comical things that step in to stop them, right? Like gun jammings and slipping on banana peels and stuff like that. Those sorts of coincidences are just not sort of commonplace. And yet they would be if time travel was possible, is Horwitz's argument, right? You might still be unsatisfied. I'll come to the response to this sort of issue in a second. All right, so one response here, and this might be what you're getting at, Adam, is that the chance of event is quite context dependent, right? It really depends on the context in which you're trying to evaluate probabilities as to what those probabilities are going to be, at least in a lot of cases. So here's an example. Suppose you're rolling tomatoes across Sterling Highway 100 years ago. Did Sterling Highway exist 100 years ago? Who knows? Who cares? Unlikely. Probably, anyway, whatever. What are the chances of a tomato getting squashed 100 years ago, rolling a tomato across Sterling Highway? Anyone know? Anyone have a stab? Slim. Good. Thank you. Thank you for reading the slide, Sam. Why? Because you don't have cars zooming up and down Sterling Highway 100 years ago, because you didn't have lots and lots of cars running up and down Sterling Highway, right? So you could sort of safely roll tomatoes across, right? And imagine that you're actually there 100 years ago rolling tomatoes across Sterling Highway. You would think it quite coincidental if like 5 in a row got hit by a car, right? Because the cars are so unlikely running down that road, okay? Or 20 in a row, or 100 in a row, right? It would seem like a massive coincidence just because the context is one in which things that roll across Sterling Highway 100 years ago don't typically get squashed, okay? But now suppose you're rolling tomatoes across Sterling Highway today, right? What are the chances of the tomatoes getting squashed? Pretty good. Thank you for reading. I shouldn't have put it on the slide. It just gives it away, doesn't it? They're pretty good. Why are they pretty good? Because you're going to have lots of vehicles running up and down Sterling. Imagine you're doing it at peak traffic, right, when there's lots of cars going up and down Sterling Highway. It would not be coincidental at all for, all of your tomatoes to get squashed as you're rolling them across the highway, right? So what does this show you? It shows you that, in this case, the probability of a particular event, right, the probability being one of, probability associated with a tomato getting squashed as it rolls across the highway is highly dependent on the context in which you're rolling tomatoes across the highway. If you're rolling them across the highway in a context in which there's lots of traffic down the highway, then the probability of the tomato getting squashed is quite high. If you're rolling them across the highway in a context in which there aren't very many cars rolling down the highway, then the probability of the tomatoes getting squashed is quite low, right? So probability is context dependent. So how does this help with our time travel case? Well, if you apply it to the time travel case, at best what you can conclude is that we are not in a context in which time travelers are traveling back to us to try and kill their grandfathers. Because if they were traveling back to kill their grandfathers and doing it a lot, right, there would be a lot of these coincidences, but then we would no longer see them as improbable, because we'd be in a context in which you've got lots of time travelers traveling around trying to do these events and getting thwarted every time that they do, right? So if you're in a context in which you've got time travelers traveling back to your time, repeatedly trying to kill themselves, then the coincidences, the sudden changes of heart, the gun jammings, all of those sorts of things would no longer be or seem coincidental, right? It would just seem sort of run-of-the-mill. Oh, look, there's another one of those crazy soldiers trying to kill their grandfather again. They failed. Big surprise. Why did they fail? Because they had to fail, and, we just live in an era of time travelers trying to kill themselves, right? So this is the response to Horwich's argument that Nick Smith provides, right? So Nick Smith argues that it's just a mistake about probability to think that if you don't see lots of these coincidences happening, that you should therefore conclude that time travel is improbable. Rather, if there are lots of these coincidences happening, then you should think that that's because there's lots of time travelers traveling to try and kill their grandfathers. If you don't see it, then all that tells you is that there aren't these time travelers trying to do the relevant things, right? There aren't these time travelers trying to roll tomatoes across the road. In this case, tomatoes are your grandfather. Okay, so at best we don't see such strings of coincidences. So there aren't time travelers hanging around our time, right? That doesn't tell you that there couldn't be time travelers hanging around. And it doesn't even really tell you that time travel is improbable, right? Just tells you that, as a matter of fact, the time travelers just haven't made it to our local time yet. That seems perhaps unsurprising, right? Because, as we saw last week, some of the ways in which you travel through time, like some of the sort of possible ways to do this that are allowed by the laws of physics, are pretty hard to carry out, right? And some of them may even require the advanced setting up of an exit point, right? Like a black hole that you harness in the present, and then harness one in the future, and then you can use that as a conduit, or a wormhole that's got an opening here that you have to sort of be around and have knowledge of. The fact that it's sort of hard to do, maybe that explains why you don't see these coincidences, but there's nothing wrong with time travel in these cases. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, if you think that possible worlds exist, like concretely, like David Lewis did, could you have world travel, right, and use that as a proxy for time travel? So, short answer is no, right? At least not on the way that Lewis understands possible worlds. Lewis understands possible worlds to be spatiotemporally disconnected from one another. If they're spatiotemporally disconnected from one another, it seems very hard to travel from one to the other through any normal or indeed any means whatsoever, right? If you had like a world that had multiple distinct island universes in it that had sort of bridges between them, I don't know, maybe you could do this, but look, what reason do we have to think that the world's like that? But I'll consider a possibility in a sec. Yeah.
I've heard scientific propositions that say that that would be the most logical, most logical handle, but it has to be from the time travel.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if like every possibility has different, every possibility happens in every in a different branch in the universe.
Yeah.
When you travel back and you supposedly change the past, you're just traveling down a new path where that possibility could happen.
Yeah, look, I don't think it's time travel, right? So if you have all these different possible worlds that you can travel to, right? Maybe they're connected by some branching spatiotemporal structure. It looks to me like what you're doing is traveling to a different space-time altogether, right? You're not traveling back to your local history. You're traveling to some other local history that's sort of similar to the local history you came from.
You're still traveling back to your past, it's just that when you get there, you go down a different road.
Oh, yeah. When you get there, you go down a different road. I don't really know how to make sense of that, personally, right? So, well, you travel back in time to some node in the branch, right? And then you take a different option, right? Now, either you always took the option that you did, right? In which case, traveling back in time and taking a different option means changing the past in exactly the way that time travel paradoxes, that gives rise to time travel paradoxes. Or it wasn't the case that you always chose that, but then the past is sort of unfixed and in flux, and suddenly we've got a sort of fairly radical interpretation of time on our hands.
Like, in your own original timeline, you're at the node, and then you travel down that path for a while.
Yeah.
And once you travel down there, you've always traveled down it.
Yeah.
But then you stop existing in that timeline. You go back to the node, and then you're going down another one. So you've always existed in that timeline, but now
Yeah.
you're in that other branch instead.
Yeah, I just don't know if it's time travel. We'll look at a picture in a sec involving 2 dimensions of time, right? In fact, we'll do that now. All right, so you might still want to kill your grandfather, right? And you might think that it would be good if we could build this institute for auto-infant. Sorry, did you have a question, Trilla?
You know, I was just gonna
Yeah.
because that was, I mean, I see this still being some kind of time travel because for that period of time along that branch, which later drops off and you go back in time,
Yeah.
there would still be things being experienced, even if once you go back in time and change the path that you're on that no longer exists, there would still be kind of like conscious experiences. Or it wouldn't be the case that happens. It would be the case that it happens and it doesn't happen.
But that's just as bad, I think, right? The idea that I'm just not sure I understand what the relevant notion of change here is that you use to change the path that you're on, right? So, maybe I'll actually it'll work. Yeah. Okay, so the suggestion is you've got some moment in the past here which branches, right? You travel to here, right? Normal time, you just sit in your armchair 1 second per second, you make it there. Right, then you build a time machine, you travel back to here, right? And then you go this way instead. That's the suggestion, right? Yeah, okay. So at this point, right, you chose to not travel to there, right? So if you go back and you choose to travel to there, then you bring it about that you both did travel to there and that you didn't travel to there.
But when you travel back in time, there's still the other you that continues going down the path.
Oh, I see. You travel back and then a different, right, the future you wraps around and travels down this pathway. But how do you do that, right? I mean, what are these options are sort of, at best, choices that you make, right? So you choose one thing. The sort of three branches here, the option space, is created by the choices open to the person at that node, right? So in order to get onto this branch, right, you have to be the person that's making that choice. You can't just be someone else that travels along their branch.
It's not so much a node decided by your own personal choice. It's just that once you travel back in time, you're like there's different possibilities.
Yeah.
Every universe has a different possibility, so you're traveling back and you're basically creating a universe in which the possibility that you were there now exists.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the words that you're saying. These are words like exist, change, travel back. But I think that either of these options existed at the time or they didn't, right? If they did exist at the time, then, you know, you've got to tell a story about why it is that you went one way rather than another. If they didn't exist at the time, you go back and you create one, then you've got the past being one way and then another way, and that's creating the same kind of changing the past. Anyway, let's move on. We can talk about it more in Tuesday, okay? All right, so you still want to kill your grandfather, right? You're not happy. Maybe this will help out with this discussion, right? Because this is a way of trying to do this without branching. So branching is one way to do it. I'm going to show you how to do it with a second temporal dimension instead, okay? Okay, so you want to kill your grandfather. In order to try to do this with a second temporal dimension, we need to take a detour through a little bit of material on persistence, right? So we've got this notion in the philosophy of persistence and metaphysics of time literature called perdurantism, or perdurantism, however you want to pronounce it. I think there's a fact about how it's pronounced. Perdurantists say that just as we have spatial parts, arms, legs, heads, or just one, we have temporal parts, child, adult, senior citizen, right? So close your eyes again, Brody. So just as Brody's got an arm here, and a head here, and probably another head there, we just can't see it. Surgically removed or something. He's also got temporal parts. I can't point to the temporal parts. Well, actually I can. There's one. There's one. There's one. There's one. Right? Those are his temporal parts. Slices of him at a time. Right? His full spatial slices at a time. Right? And the sort of, he's strung out in time, just the way he's sort of extended in space, you know, flailing around as he does. Then he's also extended in time, right, flailing around, right? So when he does this, as he's doing his interpretive dance, each stage, right, of that is a different temporal part of his life, okay? And so as you grow up from a small football-headed baby to something with a horrible spaghetti coming out of your face, which I think is a beard, you go through this life cycle of different temporal parts, right? So if I say, is all of Brody in the room? The answer is actually no, right? Because this room at this time contains just one slice of Brody, and he's got lots of past and future slices. If I say, is all of his spatial parts in the room? Then the answer is yes. But the point is that there are temporal parts that aren't here, okay? So we can think of this as having a space-time worm with various segments, like in Donnie Darko. Yes, what?
Don't these other temporal components have spatial components that aren't here? Like if he grew a beard.
Yeah, so all of his spatial parts at this time are here. That's probably a better way of saying it. At other times he does. So maybe he, like in the upcoming World War III, he loses both arms to a plasma grenade. His spatial part is going to be armless, right? Like later in the future. So he's going to have different spatial parts. But right now, all of his spatial parts are here. Okay. So what time travel does is it makes your space-time worm curve back on itself through time, right? So imagine taking all of Brody's, like his spatiotemporal parts that form this big temporally extended object, and then taking one end of it and wrapping it around but to reach the other end. Then that's basically what time travel does, right? It forces your perduring object to wrap back on itself, curve back on itself in some way. Okay, now death comes with the last of your temporal parts. So when Brody reaches his last temporal part, right, when after World War III, the family of the man he shot in the war come and find him and finally put an end to his war crimes, that's your death, right? That's the last temporal part Okay? Now, if we think of dying as being the end of your temporal parts, and we think as objects as extending through time, as having temporal parts, then we can think of what it is to kill your grandfather, right, as bringing it about that this is the last temporal part, right? Okay. Right. Now we're going to have two temporal dimensions. One temporal dimension is the normal timeline that we know and love. The other temporal dimension is a hypertime. At every time, there is a second temporal dimension that time is extended through, right? It's hard to conceptualize. If you think of it as a plane like this, you can sort of model it fairly straightforwardly, but actually thinking in terms of two-dimensional time is extremely difficult. It's hard enough to think in one dimension of time, I think. Anyway, let's do it. All right, so there's Tim, and there's grandfather, right? So Tim, that's Tim's perduring object, right? That's his space-time worm, right? And that's grandfather's space-time worm. So Tim's born here, he exists, he lives, and then he dies here. That's his last temporal part, right? Grandfather is born here, he exists for a while, and then that's his last temporal part, right? And he dies. Okay, so grandfather died before Tim was born. In Tim's timeline, Tim didn't travel back in time and kill grandfather, right? He didn't even try. Everything's fine, hunky-dory so far. Okay, but now they also have hypertemporal parts, right? So they're not just extended through time, they're extended through a second time dimension. Okay? So just as you're extended in one spatial dimension, this one, the y-axis, right? You're extended upwards. You're also extended acrossways in space, right? In these 2D time pictures, you're extended in one dimension of time, right? So Brody's existing normally in his one dimension of time, his space-time worm's going along, but at every moment of time, he's also smeared out through a different temporal dimension, right? And that smearing constitutes his hypertemporal parts. So what Tim the time traveler is going to do, right, instead of traveling back through normal time, he's going to travel into hypertime. And he's going to kill his grandfather in hypertime. Right? So he's going to bring it about that his grandfather's hypertemporal parts stop propagating through the second temporal dimension, even though his temporal parts continue to propagate as they did. Now the thing is, the interesting thing about this, he can do this without inducing a paradox, right? It always was the case that grandfather's hypertemporal parts were brought to an end by Tim's machinations, right? Even though grandfather survived long enough to produce Tim and bring it about that he traveled back into hypertime to stop grandfather from existing through the second temporal dimension, right? I'll leave hypertim for a minute. Yeah, Tom? Is there any point in doing that? Yeah, so here's the point in doing this. You get to say you can kill your grandfather, right? So here's the thing. It's possible that there are two temporal dimensions, right? It's just an empirical fact about our universe that there's only one temporal dimension. Okay? So it's possible to kill your grandfather. If there are two temporal dimensions, you would be able to kill him by stopping his hypertemporal parts from propagating through hypertime, right? And that is death just as much as propagating through normal time is death, right? So it's possible for Tim to kill his grandfather so long as he does it in hypertime. Since hypertime is possible, it's not logically impossible to kill your grandfather.
So would
well, it depends on if you have any sort of awareness of your hypertemporal parts. Here's the thing. You don't have any awareness of your temporal parts, right? You don't notice if, well, maybe you do. Depends on how memory works. If you can remember through a second time dimension, then you might actually have some knowledge of what's going to happen. But, you know, set that aside. All I'm talking about is the mere possibility of what's happening here, right? One time dimension, looks like it's impossible to kill your grandfather. Add a second temporal dimension, travel into that second temporal dimension, you can kill your grandfather. So killing your grandfather is not impossible, as we've been saying, right? Just because it's possible to have two time dimensions. Trilo. It is. It's very similar to creating multiple worlds like such situations. That's why I was wondering if this is what you had in mind, right? So another way of doing this sort of thing would be to have branching, right? I actually think it's less clear how to do this with branching, because I think that the thing about this is that you've got causation running along this time axis, right? And you've got causation running along this time axis, and they're separable, right? The causation that goes through hypertime is different to the causation that goes through time. So grandfather can cause Tim to exist in time, but then be killed by Tim in hypertime, because the two causal line, two sort of causations that are linked to a temporal dimension can come apart, right? In the branching case, it just looks like one notion of causation throughout the whole branching universe, and so I find it very difficult to understand how you could properly build this kind of scenario.
This view you can jump between the branches more freely as opposed to going back to the node and then starting from a different.
I see. I see. I mean, maybe in the end, maybe.
Is that what
Oh, I see.
this view is, or is
No, this is not branching, right? These are linear time dimensions. There's just two of them, and they're orthogonal to one another.
I mean, even with time travel, the same thing happens on our timeline, right? So the grandfather
Yeah.
and Tim time travel still goes on and
Yeah.
and shit and stuff. But in a different timeline, all that doesn't happen because the grandfather does.
Well, it depends on what goes on in hypertime, right? In hypertime, so maybe I'll go on to hypertim, and that'll help you. It probably won't, but let's see what happens. Okay, I'll come to you in a sec, Brody. All right. So does this really solve the problem? Does this really make you able to kill your grandfather? Is it really possible, right? So here's the thing that bugs me about this, right? So this someone put forward this idea in a couple of recent papers. The thing that bugs me about this idea is that we can always put in hypertim, right? So grandfather causes Tim to exist in this timeline, right? He, meets a nice girl, they have children, those children, I was going to say those children have children, but that's not cool. Those children meet some people, and then those people that are not related to them have children. And then Tim comes into existence, right? Tim is one of those children. Guys, sorry, just quiet for a sec. So Tim comes into existence at that point, right? But grandfather has also got hypertemporal parts. So maybe in hypertime, this other time dimension, grandfather can give rise to a different kind of being, hypertim, right, who's extended in hypertime. And maybe hypertim is really jealous of Tim and wants to kill grandfather in his own timeline, right? Can hypertim travel back through hypertime and kill grandfather? Well, it looks like the paradox is exactly the same. We've just reformulated it in that time dimension, right? So in the original time dimension, you had grandfather bringing about Tim trying to travel back in time to take grandfather out of existence, but that looks like it's paradoxical because that's going to take Tim out of existence. Now what we've got is hyper-grandfather, right, grandfather's hyperparts, giving rise to hypertim, and then hypertim traveling back in his timeline to try and take grandfather out of existence, right? Hypertim can no more take grandfather out of existence in hypertime than Tim can take grandfather out of existence in time, right? What does this mean? It means that the grandfather paradox can be reformulated for any n-dimensional universe that you have. No matter how many time dimensions you have, I can formulate a hypertemporal paradox involving hypertim and hypergrandfather, right? So if you restrict the claim that it's impossible to kill grandfather in the following way and say it's impossible to kill grandfather in your timeline, right, then that's true. It's genuinely impossible to kill your grandfather in that timeline because in this time, Tim can't kill grandfather here. He can go to hypertime and kill him in hypertime. Hypertim could travel here and maybe kill grandfather in time, but he can't kill him in hypertime, right? And add as many time dimensions as you want, as many hypergrandfathers and hypertims, and you'll always have the same problem. The grandfather paradox will arise within any timeline. So it's still impossible to kill your grandfather within a timeline. It's interesting, though, that in some sense it's possible to kill your grandfather in a different time dimension, right? So it's not exactly set in stone that it's a contradiction for you to kill your grandfather, contrary to what Lewis said, right? Even so, I think that it's a small jump to in your own timeline, and I think there is still a contradiction lurking there. Okay, Brody.
One thing I was going to ask about was it seems like it throws up the idea of conceivability, and then which means that if it's conceivable, then it's possible.
In what way? That having two time dimensions is conceivable, therefore it's possible?
That Tim can go back in
Hypertime.
Until
Hyper-grandfather, yeah.
Yeah. So if it's conceivable, it doesn't necessarily mean it's possible, does it?
I don't even think you need the conceivability possibility bridge in this case. I mean, it would take us too far afield to get into the relationship between conceivability and possibility. That's sort of this big thing that, interestingly, Dave Chalmers, the person who picked Claire as the winner of our drawing competition, has written a lot about, right, the relationship between conceivability and possibility. He's talking about physicalism and dualism and the idea that zombies are conceivable, therefore they're possible. But in this case, it's just an empirical possibility, right, a straightforward, compatible with the laws of nature, that there is a second time dimension. And given that empirical possibility, the rest of this seems to follow, right? You don't need to take the bridge through conceivability to get there, I don't think. Yeah.
Hypothetically, if you had the moving spotlight theory,
Yeah.
and you tied causation to the present, the special
Yeah.
present causing the spotlight,
Yep.
could you go back in time and do something without causally affecting it? It's causation under that view is not.
I'm not even, if you attach causation to the moving spotlight, I don't think you can travel back in time, because it would require moving causally against the direction of the spotlight. Yeah. Do you have a question, Oliver?
I was going to ask, is it fair to say that Tim's really killing his grandfather in that case? Isn't it just Tim's killing hyper-grandfather, which isn't his grandfather, it's hyper-grandfather?
Right. So this is an interesting point, right? So is it fair to say that this is really death, right? So it looks like you've got death 1, end of your temporal parts, death 2, end of your hypertemporal parts, right? Why? So you're saying, well, is it really death when you, is it really killing your grandfather when you stop his hypertemporal parts from propagating rather than his temporal parts? The problem is I don't really see a way to break the symmetry between them. I don't really see a way to say that ending the propagation of hypertemporal parts is not death without also saying that ending the propagation of someone's temporal parts is not death, right? And if you're forced to say that, then it looks like nothing can die if you take that sort of line. So this would be one way to put pressure on this kind of argument, but you would have to show that that death 1, death in time, death 2, death in hypertime, are different kinds of death. Maybe because you think that these are different people or something like that, but it's the same person, right? I mean, just as Brody's got different temporal parts, right? You don't want to say that, his past temporal part is a different person, right? So why should it be any different with a hypertemporal part? Now, I'm not saying that you can't make this argument that you're trying to make, but I think that it's going to be difficult because it looks like, insofar as we understand temporal parts, insofar as we understand hypertemporal parts, they're sort of on a par with each other. And so trying to deny that you can kill someone by stopping their temporal parts, stopping their hypertemporal parts from their temporal parts, looks like it's going to be a difficult line to follow.
So does that come down to identity?
It might come down to identity. I guess the point I'm making is that I've got no better grasp on temporal identity than on hypertemporal identity on this picture, right? And I'm inclined to think that, killing someone, taking them out of existence, hypertemporally is just the same as doing it temporally, really. Or at least, I think it would require some fairly sort of heavy-duty argument to show otherwise. Adam and then Zach. Okay, Zach. Well, we don't have hypertemporal parts, right? Because we know that our universe is four-dimensional. His hypertemporal grandfather is his grandfather, right? Because his grandfather just is the sum of his temporal parts and his hypertemporal parts, right? Yeah, no, but this is not our universe, right? So what we're looking at is a possible case that has 2 time dimensions. We know that our universe has only got 4 dimensions. Well, we don't know that, but best guess is that it's only got 4 dimensions, modulo string theory, but they're spatial dimensions anyway, so who cares? This is a possible situation in which there are 2 time dimensions. In that possible situation, grandfather is as connected to his hypertemporal parts as he is to his temporal parts. Of course, we're not connected to our hypertemporal parts because we don't have any, right? But that's no objection to this being a possible scenario. If we did, would we know? I don't know, maybe. You're stopping his grandfather from